Tessa Monroe had never been lucky, not even once. No lottery win, no game night miracle, not even a free pastry from a punch card she'd filled to the brim. Her life had been a series of almosts, near wins, lost chances. She sat at her tiny desk, refreshing her inbox for the fourth time that morning, even though she already knew what she'd see. Dear Miss Monroe, thank you for your submission. We regret to inform you. Tessa let the email fade into the background as she slumped back in her creaky chair. Another no. Another door closed. The sting was familiar now, a dull throb in her chest that always came when hope took a hit. She stared blankly at the blinking cursor on her screen, feeling like the universe was constantly dangling something just out of reach. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A message from her landlord. Rent is due. Let me know if you're behind again. Tessa groaned, rubbing her face. Of course. She glanced down at her coffee mug, the bitter instant kind that tasted more like burned rubber than energy. She couldn't even recall the last time she had a real espresso. The city was squeezing her dry, one unpaid invoice at a time. Nick's voice rang in her head, sharp, smug, and unforgettable. You always aim for dreams that don't belong to people. Like us, Tess? If you stopped chasing fantasies, maybe you'd be content. Nick. The guy who once called her brilliance magnetic, who once told her she was made for big things. But that admiration faded fast when her writing gigs turned out to be unpaid internships and late nights meant no date nights. When ambition became inconvenient, so did she. You're just too much, he'd said before walking out. The worst part? She believed it. She let his words sink in like thorns wrapping around her dreams, choking them until she almost gave up altogether. So, when an email popped into her inbox with the subject line, "Congratulations, you've won," her first reaction wasn't joy. It was suspicion. A luxury retreat on a private island? She narrowed her eyes and opened it slowly. Then she checked the sender, the terms, the fine print, then again, and again. Everything looked real. It didn't make sense. People like her didn't win things like this. Just as she was trying to convince herself not to delete it, a hand reached over and snatched her phone. Are you seriously thinking of turning this down? Her best friend Naomi asked, waving. The screen at her like it was a golden ticket. Tessa nearly jumped. Hey, give it back! Naomi shook the phone in her face. You triple-checked it already. It's legit, Tessa hesitated. Yeah, but what if I show up and it's some horror movie trap, or I wake up missing a kidney? Naomi gave her a flat look. You watch way too much late-night cable. This is real. You won something for once. Let yourself have it. I don't know, Tessa said, folding her arms. Stuff like this doesn't happen to me. Maybe because you never let it, Naomi replied, perching on the desk. Every time something good comes your way, you brace for it to fall apart instead of enjoying it. Tessa opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Maybe Naomi had a point. When was the last time she did something that wasn't tied to survival? Rent, work, rejection. It had become her entire life. Maybe this trip could be a pause, a break from constantly treading water. She stared at the email again. Then softly, like it might disappear if she said it too loud, she whispered, Okay. The email was real. The offer was real. And now, the ship standing in front of her was absolutely, unmistakably real. Tessa stood at the dock, gripping the handle of her scuffed old suitcase. The cruise ship before her was enormous, gleaming with gold trim and polished decks. It looked like something out of a billionaire's daydream. She felt like an imposter just standing near it. Elegant passengers passed her, their luggage designer, their sunglasses reflecting the sun like they owned it. Tessa stood there in her clearance rack sundress and a suitcase that had survived 3 broken zippers and 1 baggage claim disaster. She suddenly wondered if this was all a mistake. But then the soft sounds of a live band drifted down from the upper deck. Laughter rang out. The music mingled with the ocean breeze, wrapping around her like a welcome hug. And for the first time, in years, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. She stepped forward. For as long as she could remember, Tessa had dreamed of escaping, not permanently, just a weekend, a week. Enough time to breathe, enough time to live like the characters in her travel essays. She had written about places like this, faraway islands, sparkling seas, but she had never imagined actually going to one. Now here she was, boarding a vessel that smelled like fresh linen and sea salt, where luxury didn't feel borrowed but built into the walls. She reminded herself this wasn't a fantasy. It was a trip she had somehow impossibly won, but still, it felt like stepping into a novel. The guests sipped champagne, the sun painted the sky in orange streaks, and the sea stretched out like a painting that never ended. Tessa wasn't someone who believed in miracles. She believed in effort, in staying up late and grinding through unpaid gigs. She had worked herself to exhaustion, hoping someone would finally see her, pick her, believe in her. And now, for once, the world had offered her something without her, having to beg for it. Before we continue the story, if you're new here, please consider subscribing to our channel. It really helps us keep making stories like this. So maybe this one time she could say yes. No baggage, no pressure. Just her, the ocean, and whatever came next. That night, the cruise ship's ballroom sparkled under golden chandeliers. Tessa stood at the edge of the room in a gown she could never afford, borrowed from a generous woman she'd met that afternoon. The lace brushed her skin in a way that made her feel like she belonged, even though every nerve said she didn't. She wasn't planning to dance. She wasn't planning to meet anyone. Then a deep voice cut through. The orchestra's music. May I have this dance? Tessa turned toward the voice, her breath catching as her eyes met his. He wore a sleek black suit, a silver mask hiding most of his face. But his eyes, those deep, unreadable eyes, locked onto hers with quiet intensity. There was something magnetic about the way he held himself, confident but not arrogant, like a man used to moving through rooms without explanation. She hesitated. Every part of her wanted to say no. This wasn't her scene, and he definitely wasn't her type. But instead, her hand reached out on instinct, trembling slightly as he took it. "I'm not much of a dancer," she murmured. He tilted his head, lips curving. "You're doing just fine." His hand rested on the small of her back, guiding her into a gentle waltz. His touch was warm, his movements smooth, effortless, as though he was born knowing how to lead a dance without saying a D word. Tessa followed, her body responding to his with surprising ease. This wasn't anything like the clumsy two-steps she remembered from wedding receptions. This felt rehearsed, intimate. She didn't want to fall for a stranger in a mask. But the music swirled around them. The lights dimmed to a golden haze, and she began to wonder if she had any control left. "You move like you've done this before," he said softly. She laughed, breathless. "I've stumbled through a few weddings." "Then you're a fast learner." They glided across the floor, steps matching as though choreographed. He didn't ask her where she was from or what she did for a living. He didn't talk much, at all. But when he leaned in and whispered, "You feel familiar," something in her chest tightened. "You don't even know my name," she replied, half smiling. "I heard someone say it earlier," he said. "Tessa, it suits you." She blinked. "That's cheating," he chuckled. "Then let me be honest. I'm just someone passing through. You can call me a traveler." "That's not much of a name," she teased. "It's all you need tonight." He spun her gently, catching her back into his arms as the music faded. They didn't let go. Later, as the ballroom emptied and the glitter faded into soft shadows, he led her through the winding halls of the ship. They ended up on the open deck, where the moonlit ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. Tessa leaned against the railing, the breeze brushing her skin as she caught her breath. "So," she said quietly, "do I get a real name?" He exhaled, smiling at the horizon instead of her. "Wouldn't that spoil the magic? You already know mine. Seems unfair." He looked at her then, a bit more seriously. "Call me Rowan." "Rowan," she repeated, testing it on her tongue. They stood in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. The ocean whispered below them. The stars blinked overhead, And then, without warning, he kissed her, slow and sure, like he had all the time in the world. Her heart raced. She told herself not to melt, but her body didn't listen. Tessa had no plans to see him again. But fate, as it turned out, didn't care much for plans. The next morning, she wandered into the ship's reading lounge. She was halfway through flipping a page when someone slid into the seat beside her. She glanced up and froze. No mask this time, just him, Rowan, with sharp cheekbones, a lazy smirk, and the same quiet fire in his eyes. "I didn't picture you as a bookworm," he said. She closed her book, heart thudding. "And I didn't peg you as the kind of guy who reappears." Maybe we both misjudged. They spent the afternoon together, talking, laughing, walking the deck as though they were old friends. By the third day, she had forgotten what life felt like without him. He showed her hidden corners of the ship, made her laugh until her cheeks ached, and pulled her into dances on quiet balconies under the stars. She had told herself this trip was about escape, not connection. No distractions, no fairy tales. But Rowan didn't feel like a fantasy. He felt real in a way she hadn't expected. The way he looked at her, the way he listened, it was disarming, dangerous. She started slipping. It wasn't just his charm. It was the way he always knew where to find her. Whether she was at the pool, the observation deck, or wandering the quieter hallways of the ship, he'd show up, like gravity had pulled him there. Always just her. Always just in time. At night, under the open sky, he'd whisper her name and press soft kisses against her temple. And she would forget to be cautious. Forget that she didn't know him. Then came the moment they reached the island. Tessa stood on the upper deck as the ship slowed near the shore. Her breath caught. It was more beautiful than she imagined. Endless white sand, palm trees waving lazily in the breeze, and crystal waters that shimmered like gemstones. Gorgeous, isn't it? Rowan said behind her, but when she turned to respond, he wasn't looking at the view. He was watching her. The way he said it made her cheeks warm. "It doesn't feel real," she whispered. "Then let's make it real," he replied, holding out his hand. Every alarm in her brain said to be careful. But her heart overrode it. She took his hand. The island was more than just beautiful. It felt otherworldly, the kind of place untouched by time. He led her to secret coves and hidden lagoons, places that weren't on any itinerary. Sunlight filtered through the trees and reflected off the water like liquid gold. They floated in silence, fingers grazing beneath the surface. When he looked at her, it felt like she was the only thing that mattered. She didn't want the spell to break. But even in paradise, a shadow followed. Something about the way Rowan held her hand, tighter than before, set off a flicker of doubt. He smiled like always, but his eyes, they held something else. Tessa shoved the feeling down. Not every perfect thing had to be fake. Not everything had to fall apart, but some part of her, buried deep, already knew this wasn't going to last. That evening, Rowan took her to a high ridge overlooking the crashing waves. The island stretched out below them like something from a painting, untouched, timeless. The salty air tangled in her hair as she leaned into him, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "This feels like a dream," Tessa whispered, barely audible over the sound of the ocean below. Rowan gave a quiet chuckle, resting his chin on the top of her head. "Maybe it is." She turned to look at him, sensing something beneath the calm exterior. "What are you not telling me?" He paused a second too long. Then he smiled, easy, effortless, like he always did. "Nothing. Just don't forget this." That night, he kissed her harder. Like he was saying goodbye. Tessa didn't know it then, but it would be the last time she saw him. The next morning, she woke to silence. The villa they'd shared was cold, the sheets untouched. Rowan was gone. No note, no text, no trace. At first, she tried to stay calm. Maybe he went for a walk. Maybe he was planning something. But as the hours passed and the sun dipped lower, her hope began to crack. She searched the beach, the lagoon, the cliffs. She called his name until her voice gave out, but the only thing that answered was the wind. Rowan had disappeared without a word, without a goodbye, without even proof that he had ever existed. She ran to the pool area, stopping one of the resort staff, gripping the woman's arm a little too tightly. "Have you seen him?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Tall guy, dark hair, green eyes. His name's Rowan. We've been together this whole time." The staff member blinked, polite confusion on her face. "I'm sorry, miss, I don't know anyone by that name." Tessa's stomach twisted. "You must have seen him. He's been with me everywhere. Someone has to know him." She tried again. Other employees, guests, the front desk, the same look. Every time, mild confusion. Apologetic smiles, no recognition, no one knew who she was talking about. It was as if he had been erased. Back on the ship, she went to security. There must be footage. Cameras. Records, she said, trying to keep her voice steady as she explained where he'd stayed, the places they'd gone, how he'd spent every single day by her side. A security officer listened, then exchanged a look with his colleague. That look, the kind that said they were humoring her. "Miss Monroe," the officer said slowly, "are you sure this person existed?" That sentence shattered something in her. "Am I sure?" she snapped, her voice rising. "Are you asking me if I imagined him?" She stormed away, hands shaking. Of course she was sure. She had kissed him, slept beside him, heard him whisper her name in the dark. She wasn't crazy, but why did it feel like she was the only one who remembered? She stayed up all night, sitting at the edge of the dock, watching the waves roll in and out, hoping she'd see him step out of the shadows, say it was all a misunderstanding. But he never came. By the time the ship was ready to sail back, she knew he wasn't coming back. She boarded with the rest of the passengers, but her body moved on autopilot. Her heart stayed behind on that island, trapped in the echo of a lie. Back home, her small apartment felt like a coffin. The once comforting sounds of the city now grated against her nerves. She tried to push through, tried to bury the memories, beneath work and deadlines. But then came the nausea. At first, she blamed it on stress or bad food. But when it wouldn't stop, when it left her dizzy and dry heaving, she bought a test, then a second, and a third, all positive. Tessa sank to the bathroom floor, staring at the plastic stick in her trembling hands. No, this couldn't be real. She had spent weeks trying to forget him, trying to pretend he hadn't mattered, that he'd just been a brief, cruel mistake. And now this. Now she was pregnant, with the child of a man who might never have even told her his real name. She closed her eyes, chest heaving. The tiles felt cold beneath her palms. How could someone disappear so completely and still leave something behind? Days passed in a fog. She didn't tell anyone, she couldn't. Her emotions spiraled between grief and fury. He had left her with nothing but questions, and now a life growing inside her. And then came the second blow. At the ultrasound appointment, the technician turned the screen slightly, adjusting the wand as she smiled. "Everything looks great," the woman said kindly. "And congratulations, you're expecting more than one." Tessa blinked. "Twins?" The technician hesitated, then smiled wider. "Triplets. Triplets." The word hit like a thunderclap. She couldn't breathe. "3, not 1, not 2. 3. Tessa's vision swam as the room tilted around her. She clutched the edge of the exam table, trying not to faint. How was she supposed to do this? She could barely cover rent. She could barely hold her life together as it was. How could she raise 3 babies alone? She stumbled home that evening, locking the door behind her as if it would keep the reality out. Her thoughts spiraled. She cried until her throat burned. But worse than the fear, worse than the loneliness, was one unbearable truth. She didn't even know the father's real name. There was no trace of him. No last name. No contact info. No social accounts. Not even a receipt or a scribbled note. Nothing. Had he ever existed? Was she just a fool caught in the perfect lie? She whispered his name into the quiet of her dark apartment. Rowan. But it sounded like fiction now. a dream she had confused for something real. And then, in a casual conversation, everything changed. She was at Naomi's place, nursing a cold cup of tea, lost in thought as her friend chatted about her husband's return. "He's back from his cruise shift," Naomi said. Kept talking about some crazy guest on a luxury ship, guy who threw a huge private party. Total show-off. Tessa looked up slowly. "What cruise?" Naomi scrolled her phone. "Something fancy, Carter's Mirage, I think." Carter. Tessa's blood ran cold. Her mug nearly slipped from her hands. That name. Tessa barely heard the rest of Naomi's sentence. Her pulse roared in her ears. Carter's Mirage. The name hit her like a truck. "Can you say that again?" she asked, her voice tight. Naomi blinked. Yeah, Carter's Mirage. That's the name of the cruise line." "Carter," Tessa repeated, heart thudding. That's his name." Naomi frowned. "Wait, who?" Tessa couldn't even answer. Her brain was already racing. Rowan. That name. Was it even real? He never gave her a last name, never told her where he was from. And now, the one name that connected to him was Carter. The name of the cruise. The irony felt cruel. That night, she met Naomi's husband, Drew. He had just gotten home from another shift aboard Carter's Mirage, and Tessa didn't wait for pleasantries. "Do you know someone named Rowan?" she asked the moment he sat, and he furrowed his brow. "Rowan? Tall, dark hair, green eyes. I met him on the ship months ago," she pressed. Drew scratched his head. "Oh, you mean Roman Carter?" Her breath caught. "Roman Carter?" "Yeah, he owns the whole cruise line. The guy's a legend. People call him the Mirage Man, private island, secret parties, no press. He's a billionaire but keeps everything under wraps. Brings women on those trips like it's some exclusive fantasy getaway." Tessa's stomach turned. Drew kept talking. "He's loaded, obviously, but the stories, let's just say he doesn't do long-term. Every few months there's a new girl. They vanish afterward like they were never there." Tessa stared at the table, everything inside her crumbling. "Wait," Naomi interrupted, her voice rising. "Are you saying he—" Tessa nodded slowly. "He didn't just vanish, he erased me, like I was a mistake he couldn't wait to forget." Drew looked stunned. "You were with him?" She didn't answer. Her silence was confirmation enough. Later that night, she sat in her room in the dark, one hand pressed to her stomach. She could feel the faint flutter of movement now. Not just one life, 3. And the man who created them had done this before. Lied. Vanished. Pretended they didn't matter. She clenched her fists. Not this time. She wasn't going to be another whisper in his legacy. Another forgotten woman. If Roman Carter thought she'd disappear quietly, he had underestimated the wrong woman. She sold old furniture, took every last freelance job she could find, and scrounged enough to afford a basic ticket. No luxury suite this time. Just her, a duffel bag, and sheer determination. She booked passage back to the island, back to him. Carter's Mirage glowed on her screen, the same ship that had changed everything. But this time she wasn't going as a guest, she was returning as a storm. The moment she stepped aboard, the memories surged like a wave. His touch, his voice, the way he had smiled at her under the stars. But she pushed it down. This wasn't about the past. This was for her children. She moved through the ship unnoticed, dressed plainly, avoiding eye contact. But everywhere she looked, she saw him. His influence, his name, his presence in the luxury that surrounded her. She asked staff members. Nothing. She asked about Rowan. Silence. "Roman Carter," she finally whispered. That changed everything. Faces stiffened, eyes darted. People knew, but no one spoke. He was protected, untouchable. Or so he thought. Tessa didn't stop. She watched, listened, eavesdropped on hushed conversations in quiet corners. Eventually, in the cruise bar, she heard his name again. A bartender polishing glasses muttered to a fellow server. "Roman's got another one, huh?" "Yeah," the server chuckled. "Same old playbook. brings them in, sweeps them off their feet, and then, poof, they're gone. They always think they're the first, the bartender said. He makes them feel special, every single one. Tessa's jaw clenched, her pulse thudded. She had been one of them. Just another chapter in his well-rehearsed story. But this time, he picked the wrong ending. Another worker joined in. You know what's wild? I heard he's actually about to propose. Tessa's head snapped toward the conversation. To who? One of them asked. Sophia something, daughter of that tech billionaire. He's been serious about her for a while now. This trip's supposed to be the announcement. Tessa felt like the floor tilted beneath her. He was going to marry someone else. He hadn't just left her, he'd replaced her. That night she didn't sleep. She sat on the lower deck, curled against the wall, her mind spinning. He had lied to her, but worse than that, he had discarded her like she meant nothing. And now he was walking into a new life, while she carried 3 lives inside her, alone. He had no idea she was back, and she was going to use that. The ship arrived at the island again 3 days later. This time, when she stepped onto the golden sands, she didn't feel awe. She felt fury. And there he was, standing at the entrance of the estate, greeting new arrivals with a tailored smile, dressed in white linen like some magazine cover fantasy. He looked even more polished than she remembered, but for the first time she saw the man behind the illusion. Roman Carter, the man who had ruined her, the man she came to ruin. He didn't notice her immediately, but when he finally looked up and saw her, the mask slipped. Only for a second, but she saw it. Shock, recognition, fear. Then the charm returned just as quickly. But it was too late. She had seen the flicker, and she knew. He remembered her. She walked past him like a stranger, her chin high, her expression unreadable. He didn't stop her, didn't speak. But she could feel it, the tension in the air, the storm in his chest. Let him wonder, she thought. Let him feel what she felt for months. That night, a note appeared under her door. No name, no explanation. Just 2 words, Midnight Terrace. Tessa stared at it for a long time. She already knew what this was. He wanted to test her, to see if she still belonged to him. But Roman Carter had no idea. She was done playing his game. She had come to end it. The night air was warm, heavy with sea salt and tension. Tessa walked toward the private terrace like she belonged there, chin high, step steady. The note burned in her hand, but she didn't need it to remember where she was going. She had memorized this route once before, and there he was. Roman Carter stood with his back to her, one hand on the railing, the other loosely holding a glass of whiskey. He turned as she stepped into the lantern-lit space, his eyes scanning her slowly, trying to read the version of her he hadn't expected to see again. You came, he said, voice calm like nothing had happened. Tessa gave him a measured smile, one she'd practiced in the mirror for days. Did you think I wouldn't? His lips curved slightly. I'd be lying if I said I didn't hope you would. She let out a short laugh, the kind that comes after betrayal, the kind that leaves a scar. You always were good at hoping for the impossible. Roman stepped closer, trying to close the distance, but she didn't budge. Tessa, Save it, she interrupted. I'm not here for an apology or lies dressed up like explanations. He looked genuinely taken aback, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she did the one thing he'd never expect. She reached for his hand. He froze. His fingers twitched. Good, she thought. He needs to feel what I felt. Her voice softened, deliberately. Tell me something, Roman. If I hadn't come back, would you have told me who you really were? The silence was an answer all by itself, but he gave her one anyway. A quiet, hesitant no. And there it was, the truth behind the silk-tied illusion. She nodded slowly, stepping back, letting his hand fall away like it meant nothing. Her heart felt like a stone, but her face showed none of it. Well then, she whispered, now we both know exactly what we meant to each other. He looked at her, something unreadable behind his eyes, but before he could speak again, she smiled. Charming, light, and fake as glass. But it's fine, she said. Let's not dwell on the past. Let's just enjoy the rest of this trip, like old times. His brows furrowed, uncertain, but she could see the flicker of hope in him. Let him believe it. For the next 3 days, she played the part. Tessa let Roman think he had her back. She laughed at his jokes, danced when he reached for her hand, let him lead her through the same games he played with all the others. But this time she was studying him. She memorized his routines. She noted which staff flinched when he walked, by which doors stayed locked. She chatted with servers, managers, anyone who was close enough to his operation to slip and say the wrong thing. She found the hidden paths his business took, off-the-books payments, discreet transfers, unregistered accounts, every carefully concealed string he pulled behind the scenes. He thought she was distracted by charm. She was dismantling his kingdom. Then she discovered the final piece. Her name was Sophia. Not a fling. Not a casual guest. Sophia Remington. Daughter of a billionaire. Roman's fiancée, the one he actually wanted. Tessa had thought she'd be furious. But as she stood there, watching Sophia laugh at something Roman whispered into her ear during a group dinner, she didn't feel rage. She felt strategy. Because now she had everything she needed. She waited until the island's grand gala. The kind of party where secrets slipped out between clinks of champagne and fake smiles. The kind of party Roman used to impress his world. She wore a black gown that fit like armor, her hair pinned high, her expression calm. The night glowed with music and wealth. Guests danced beneath fairy lights. Waiters offered drinks balanced on silver trays, and Tessa waited. She knew it was coming. It always did. Just before midnight, security stormed the ballroom. Whispers rippled across the room. A man in uniform approached, holding something in his gloved hand, a necklace, expensive, diamond, recognizable. This item was reported stolen, the guard announced. And we have reason to believe this woman took it. Gasps. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Tessa didn't move. Roman was at her side. In an instant, playing the shocked gentleman perfectly. "What's going on?" he asked the guard, voice wrapped in false concern. Tessa almost laughed. The performance was flawless. Roman had planted it. He wanted to humiliate her, to erase her all over again. But this time she was ready. She stepped forward before anyone else. Could speak, her voice clear and calm. "I'd like you to check the security cameras, please." The guard hesitated. Roman stiffened. "I'm sure they'll show exactly who placed that necklace in my room," she added, louder now. "Right, Roman." His mask cracked. There it was, the panic behind the charm. She turned to the crowd, lifting her chin. "Roman Carter isn't just a liar," she said. "He's a professional one. This is what he does. He makes women believe they matter, then he disappears." Gasps, whispers, the sound of champagne glasses freezing midair. Roman reached for her arm. "Tessa, don't do this." She pulled away. "Don't worry," she said. "I'm not just here to ruin your image." And then she turned to Sophia, standing just feet away in a pale gold dress, her eyes wide. "I'm here for you." The whole room went still. "You deserve to know who you're marrying," Tessa said gently. "Because he left me too. He vanished without a word." Sophia's face paled. "But that's not the whole story," Tessa added. "Because he didn't just leave." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He left me pregnant." The entire ballroom erupted. The words hit the room like a lightning strike. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, glasses were lowered. Eyes turned, not just toward her, but toward Roman. Tessa stood her ground, hands steady, voice unwavering. "I'm carrying his children," she said, louder now, letting the truth settle in every corner of the glittering ballroom. 3. Them. Roman flinched like she had struck him. Sophia stared at him, her mouth open in disbelief. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice trembling. Roman looked like he wanted to deny it, wanted to lie, but the weight of the silence crushed him. He opened his mouth, then closed it. No words came. The charm, the mask, the control gone. Tessa took a slow step forward. "He knew," she said softly. "He knew, and he vanished. Left me alone to figure it out, to survive, to carry all of it, by myself." The crowd buzzed now. Whispers rose into a wave. Some guests looked disgusted, others confused. A few leaned in, hungry for more scandal. But Tessa wasn't speaking for them. She turned her gaze back to Roman, and this time, her voice shook, not from fear, but from the weight of everything she had carried alone. "You could have walked away from me, Roman. You could have ended it like an adult. But instead, you made sure no one would remember me at all." He stepped toward her now, the confidence drained from his face. "Tessa, I didn't know—" "You knew enough," she snapped, holding her hand up. "You knew I trusted you. You knew I let you in. And you used all of it to make me disappear." He was silent, so she gave them all one last gift. She pulled out her phone, tapped a recording, and let his voice echo through the speakers. "She still loves me. She'll never leave. I just need her gone. This is the cleanest way." Gasps, cries. A glass shattered somewhere in the background. Roman went pale. Sophia stepped back from him like she'd been slapped. Her expression wasn't just anger, it was betrayal. She stared at the man beside her like he was a stranger. "How many?" she whispered. "How many women have you done this to?" Roman looked lost. Tessa gave her the answer. "Too many." Sophia's face crumpled as she turned, storming out of the room, heels clicking like gunshots across marble. Roman didn't chase her. He didn't move. He looked around at the guests, but no one stepped in. No one came to save him. And then he dropped. To his knees, right there in the middle of the room, Roman Carter fell apart. He reached for Tessa's hand, gripping it like a lifeline. "Please," he said. "Don't leave, don't do this." But she didn't flinch. She stared down at him, the man who once made her feel invincible, now crumbling at her feet. "You already left," she said quietly. "You left the moment. You decided I was disposable." Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. "Not yet. I searched for you," she whispered. "I convinced myself something happened, something real, because you couldn't just vanish like that. Not after what we shared." He looked up at her, devastated. "But you did," she said. "You disappeared like none of it mattered." The tears finally fell, hot and angry. "I waited," she choked out. "I waited for a man who never planned to come back. And I did, it all alone. I bought groceries with shaking hands. I saw 3 heartbeats on a screen without you. I built a life with your children inside me. And you were nowhere." Roman looked like he couldn't breathe. She took a step back, wiping her tears roughly. "And now you're begging? Now after everything?" He opened his mouth again, but no words came. "You don't deserve them," she said. "You don't deserve any part of their lives." Roman's face crumpled, his hands shook. But she didn't care. She turned her back to him and walked out. The guests parted as she moved, whispering in her wake. But no one stopped her. Because everyone had seen the truth. Roman Carter, billionaire, charmer, illusionist, had been exposed by the one woman he couldn't erase. She didn't look back. She left the ballroom, left the island, left behind the ruins of the man who once convinced her that she didn't matter. Back on the ship, as the island disappeared over the horizon, she stood at the deck's edge. The wind tangled through her hair, and this time it didn't feel cold. It felt cleansing. The whole weight was still there, but now it had purpose. The world knew the truth. Roman Carter had fallen, and she hadn't needed revenge to do it. Just the truth. The headlines came within days. Billionaire Roman Carter exposed for secret affairs and abandoning pregnant woman. The internet did what it always does, spread the story like wildfire. The recording went viral. Sophia ended the engagement publicly. Sponsors pulled deals, stocks dropped, business partners cut ties. Roman disappeared. And Tessa, she returned home, not just as a survivor, but as someone who had taken her power back. The Apartment still had the same cracks in the ceiling, the same chipped tile, but it didn't feel the same anymore, because this time she was building her future with full awareness of who she was. She picked up extra shifts, freelanced every hour she could, bought second-hand baby gear, created a nursery from scratch. And when she stood at the doorway of that tiny room, painted with soft pastels and decorated with hope, she didn't cry from sadness. She cried from pride. Tessa didn't need applause. She didn't need interviews or social media praise. What she needed, what truly mattered, was right there, kicking gently inside her as she stood in the checkout line with her arms full of baby supplies she'd stretched her last freelance check to cover. The world still spun fast and loud, but her steps had become more grounded. She no longer walked with hesitation. She walked with purpose. There were days the memories clawed at her, days when she'd hear a song from the cruise or catch a glimpse of someone who looked like him from behind. Days she'd wake up thinking she still needed to confront him, but then she'd feel one of the babies stir inside her, and everything else faded. She wasn't living for him anymore. She was building something without him, not in spite of him, but beyond him. Some people looked at her with pity. A pregnant woman alone? 3 babies on the way? Surely she was broken. Surely she'd been left behind. But what they didn't see was the strength it took to walk through hell and not come out burned. She had cried, yes. She had broken. But she had never given up. That made all the difference. Months passed. Tessa gave birth to 3 healthy, beautiful children, 2 girls and 1 boy. She named them Hope, Isla, and River. Not because she wanted to forget the past, but because she wanted them to grow up, never feeling defined by it. Their names carried light, movement, strength. The early days were hard. Sleepless nights blurred into each other. Bottles, diapers, late-night cries. But Tessa had fought harder battles, emotional ones, soul-crushing. And this chaos, while exhausting, was filled with love. Her small apartment overflowed with baby blankets and the sound of laughter. She worked from home, wrote between naps, and accepted help when she needed it. One evening, as she rocked Isla to sleep with Hope already passed out in a bassinet and River gurgling on the floor beside her, Tessa caught her reflection in the window. Her hair was messy. Her eyes had circles beneath them. But her smile, soft and real, shone back at her. She had survived the storm, and she'd built her own shore. News of Roman Carter faded slowly. He vanished from public life after the scandal. His name still trended now and then, especially when former guests came forward with their own stories. But Tessa didn't follow the coverage. She had nothing left to prove. People still whispered her name sometimes. That's the woman who exposed him, they'd say. She's the one who stood up to him. But to her children, she was just mom. The woman who held them through every storm, who tucked them in every night, with stories that had nothing to do with betrayal, but everything to do with courage. She never told them much about their father. Not. Yet one day, when they were old enough to understand, she would sit them down and tell them the truth, not to shame him, but to show them what strength looks like when it rises from heartbreak. What it means to protect yourself even when no one else will. What it means to love, lose, and still choose to rise. She kept one photo from that cruise, a blurry one of the ocean at sunset, taken the night before everything changed. Not because she missed Roman, but because it reminded her who she was. Back then, hopeful, scared, a little lost. It reminded her how far she'd come. The rest she let go. Years later, she stood at a small community event, watching her kids chase bubbles across the grass. A woman approached her, hesitant. "Are you Tessa Monroe?" Tessa smiled gently. "Yes. I just wanted to say, what you did took guts. A lot of us." She glanced down. "We never had the courage." "Thank you." Tessa nodded, the warmth of quiet validation settling into her bones. She didn't need to be a symbol. She didn't want to be famous. But if her story helped someone else find their strength, then it had all been worth it. Roman Carter never reached out. Not and that was fine. She didn't need closure. She didn't need another apology or an explanation delivered too late. What he gave her, whether he intended to or not, was clarity. He forced her to meet the version of herself she might never have discovered otherwise. Not weak, not naive, unbreakable. Tessa didn't carry bitterness. She didn't have room for it. Her arms were already full, with 3 children who giggled like sunlight and asked questions faster than she could answer them. She'd created a home filled with joy, with honesty, with second chances. Sometimes, late at night, after the last lullaby faded and the dishes were done and the world was quiet again, she'd step out onto her small balcony and close her eyes. She could still hear the ocean sometimes, still remember the breeze, but it didn't haunt her anymore. It reminded her she had survived it, and she smiled, because some women wait to be rescued. Others rescue themselves. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know your favorite moment in the comments.